I strongly identify as a mixed race and queer female. My parents raised me to never choose just one or the other because I am multiple identities all day, every day. And as passionately as I hold my mixed race identity and sexual orientation to be true, I have grappled with the fact that the world sees my truth as a falsity. I, Joanna Lillian Thompson, am proud to say that I am the child of a Black man born and raised on the ghetto streets of Southwest Washington, D.C., and a Central American woman from Nicaragua who came to the United States with nothing but a dream for a better life. I, Joanna Lillian Thompson, am proud to identify as queer because in my 29 years of life, I have fallen in love with men and women, but ultimately see my happily ever after with another woman. Now, as a child, being mixed was not complicated. I grew up in the diverse suburb of Rockville, Maryland, right outside of the nation's capital. There, commonalities between my friends and neighbors were highlighted more so than our differences. However, as I've gotten older and moved away from home to travel both nationally and internationally to pursue my academic and career goals, I have found myself in more and more situations where my mixedness becomes a topic of interrogation. These situations are fueled by constant reminders of what makes me different from those who do not identify as mixed race. Unfortunately, I'm more than used to the typical questions of, "What are you?" or "What are you mixed with?" And statements such as, "I didn't even think being mixed was a thing," or "You don't even seem Black and Latina." Like, what is that? Exactly. During my childhood, I never thought about sexuality much. Sex was quite taboo in my family. I was that awkward only child who thought pressing the lips of my Barbie dolls together to kiss was incredibly scandalous, or getting caught in a closet, out of all places, curiously kissing one of my dolls. I mean, seriously, can only children be any weirder? But I digress. Growing up in a heteronormative and religious family where gay people were described as that way, or being told I will eventually find the right husband for me, made the concept of sexuality highly binary for me. It was not until attending college at West Virginia University, go Mountaineers, when I started to meet individuals who identify as LGBTQ. And not until attending graduate school out here in Illinois when I realized sexuality does not exist within the binary. And it took me almost 24 years to truly develop and come into my own sexuality, which I continue to develop today. Throughout this, I've always believed in a middle ground, the gray area, reading between the lines. This is what I like to call the space between. The space that is not quite Black and it's not quite white. The space that's not quite gay, but not quite straight. It's a beautiful blend of several characteristics that in this instance make me, me. So to be honest, claiming identities like mixed race and queer, both of which do not reside on either end of a binary, but rather smack dab in the middle, makes my everyday life a negotiation of the space between. It is exciting to navigate the space between, but it is not easy. The space between poses daily challenges. For example, I struggle with feeling like, am I enough? Almost daily. Am I Black enough? Am I Latina enough? Am I queer enough? And those thoughts domino into the ultimate question of, well, what does it even mean to be enough? And can enough ever really be achieved? During this mental spiral into a hopeless abyss, I end up feeling the need to break out of the space between because I feel it would just simply make my life easier. It's like my mind is telling me, Joanna, just identify as one thing so that we don't have to keep defending you to everyone all the time. But to move out of the space between into a nice condo in the binary has become much more of an option due to a recent increase in questioning of my racial and ethnic identity and my queerness. These questions are not just of what I am, but have come to subtly discredit my identities altogether. Let us begin with my mixed race identity. My girlfriend and I first met in November, this last November. And when we first met, she made it clear that she identifies as a Black lesbian and is undeniably pro-Black in her personal beliefs and behaviors. When we first started to get to know one another, she frankly informed me that I was not ethnic, that I have been whitewashed because when I shared experiences about myself, it sounded like I was sheltered, as if my parents kept all of the Black and Latina kids away from me, and that I was not like any other Black or Latina person she knows because I just didn't act like other Black girls. They didn't just sound like me. Her justification for my apparent display of a lack of ethnicity was that due to characteristics I embody, such as I'm too passive, I'm too nice, I talk properly all the time, I like baseball and hockey, I don't really listen to a lot of Black people music, I'm not urban enough, I say phrases like okie dokie, essentially negated my claim as Black and Latina. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, wow, what a girlfriend. But believe me, she is amazing and is very understanding and knows that me sharing this is not a condemnation of her words or me bad-mouthing her in any way. But what it does is serve as an example of opinions that I've been told throughout my entire life, both directly and indirectly, to explain personal characteristics that I embody, from how I act, to how I speak, to even what sports and music I like, have somehow, and unbeknownst to me, stripped me away from my racial and ethnic background. As for my queerness, the questioning comes from a sense of confusion, and honestly, many stereotypes of the LGBTQ community that continue to divide the community rather than bring it together. Prior to attending graduate school, I dated males. All my serious relationships up until that time were with men. I never thought about dating women, or even sometimes thinking of somebody who identifies as transgender, because those options were never presented to me where I'm from. However, moving to Chicago to pursue my master's and PhD, it pushed me further into the space between. In graduate school, I realized gender and sexual orientation was not as one-sided as I had previously thought. And I am proud to say that since being in graduate school, I've not only dated, but I have met and befriended people who identify across the spectrum as gender nonconforming, transgender, genderqueer, and gender fluid. And seeing the fluidity of gender identity and gender expression was something I instantly became attracted to because I already operated in a sense of racial fluidity. So this attraction led me to explore dating people who were the same sex as me, or maybe the same sex as me biologically, but expressed their identity differently. As freeing as it was for me to become more open to dating all types of people, it confused many who knew me. Friends who I grew up with back home, who only ever saw me with men, did not quite understand the sudden change. Questions like, so you're a lesbian now? Will you ever date guys again? And just because you've had bad relationships with guys doesn't mean you have to give them up for good, swirled around me. On the other end, the LGBTQ community did not embrace me fully either, with statements such as, you're just a curious straight girl, and you'll never last with a woman because you'll end up going back to a man. They always do. And so there I was, vulnerable in the space between, yearning to feel accepted by both sides while simultaneously being condemned by both for sitting on the fence. As I put this talk together, two questions came to my mind as I reflected on my seemingly now lack of minority status and confusing sexual orientation. First of all, what does it really mean to be ethnic and queer? And second, what does it mean to be genuine of any identity? I wonder, if I were to give in to stereotypes, would that make me more genuine when it comes to my identities? If I grew up on the ghetto streets as my dad, if I struggled in the shacks of Nicaragua like my mom, if I would have just continued dating men and never fallen for those who identify as LGBTQ, if I would simply pick a side, would all of that qualify me as a bona fide Black, Latina, and queer female? Personally, I cannot deny that I continue to struggle with questions of, am I enough and will I ever be enough, as I continue to navigate this space between. I have been and most likely will be reminded that as half and half, I will never be fully Black or fully Latina. I have been and most likely will be reminded that as someone who has once dated men, I will never fully be queer enough. And yes, I could feel as whole as I wanted. I could shout it from every mountaintop and be proud of the reality I hold to be true. But the world will always see me as two parts of a whole, never two whole parts. And the saddest part about these reminders is that they usually come from my own communities, my fellow Black, Latina, Latino, LGBTQ folks, my own people, who I thought would be the first to have my back in times when I'm feeling inadequate, are the first to criticize me and remind me that ultimately I'm flawed. And so, what happens now? Where do mixed race and queer individuals like myself who reside in the space between go from here? Do we stop believing in who we are, whether our identities are perceived by others correctly or not? Do we continue to convince our own people, the ones who give us the most pushback for not being enough, that yes, we are enough, and we should not be stripped of our identities simply because we look different, sound different, prefer to engage in different cultural interests, or love people for their lived experiences and not for their genitalia? Do we try and establish definite connections for what it means to be as genuine as a person of color or genuine as a queer person, so that at least we have some kind of rule book to abide by when claiming these identities? Or do we just not care? Let the sensitivity and emotion all slide and live proudly and freely in the space between? My money has been on the last choice. I actively chose and continue to choose to lose the fear of going against the grain. I developed my own voice so that I am comfortable in who I am and no longer feel a need to compare myself to an artificial standard. Because at the end of the day, I know I cannot give in to negative feelings I've experienced from discontent and questioning by others who feel I'm inaccurately portraying the racial or ethnic identity and sexual orientation I was born into. And yes, I feel I was born queer, but I know that's a whole other TED Talk. I know I cannot change people's opinions, especially if those opinions are not grounded in anything definitive aside from personal ideals. I know that the pride that I have in the claim as a queer, Black, and Latina female is my truth, my reality, and that will never falter. I'm lucky to be working at Center on Halsted, the largest LGBTQ community center in the Midwest, down in Chicago, dealing with people every day who are navigating the space between. Whether it is my colleagues or people out in the community, I get the chance to tell others that going against the grain is sexy. And I'm lucky to be finishing my PhD with the Department of Criminology, Law, and Justice at the University of Illinois at Chicago, where I'm researching how racial microaggressions affect mixed-race college students. So again, more sexiness. And through this research, I'm once again able to view the space between as constructive and not undesirable. Despite potentially not fitting into whatever cookie-cutter mold there is for being a genuine person of color or a genuine queer lady, you better believe no one can tell me I do not fit into the history of what it means to be a queer person of color. Because in America, I do. And you know what? I know I do. My place in history as a strong queer person of color has been written and continues to be written right between the lines, backed by a soundtrack of pop and hip-hop, a wardrobe of sneakers and sundresses, while hooping to the basket on the court and sliding into third on the field, with an admiration of feminine men and a passion for masculine women, with a personality that is equally passive and aggressive, yet all accomplished with a swagger that is undeniably a lady in the workplace and a beast in the streets. And whether this depiction of who I am makes sense to you or not, it is clear to me, as I thrive in the places and spaces between, that it makes this world crazy beautiful. And that the space between is in my being. It's in my blood. It's what wakes me up every night and wakes me up every morning and puts me to sleep every night, or vice versa. And you know what? That will always be enough for me. Thank you.